Please stand by. We're about to begin. Good day and welcome to the Self-Sufficiency Research Clearinghouse Paternal Incarceration Child Wellbeing webinar. Today's call is being recorded. At this time, I'd like to turn the conference over to Chris Moore, Senior Scholar at Child Trends. Please go ahead.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar on paternal incarceration and child well-being. I'm going to start with a very quick overview of the Self-Sufficiency Research Clearinghouse. It is a virtual portal of research and other resources related to self-sufficiency. It functions as an online community for researchers, practitioners, and other stakeholders interested in self-sufficiency, employment, and family and child well-being. The SSRC's purpose is to disseminate quality research. We currently have over 3,200 items in our library, including the speakers today, and we are continuously adding new resources. The library's materials are organized into 12 topical areas, shown here, comprising the field of self-sufficiency. We review every item that's included in the library for relevancy. And you can search on it by keyword or customize your search using any combination of the provided filters, reference type, target population, geographic location, or research methodology, to name a few. The Browse Topics tab lets you view selected resources categorized by the SSRC's 12 topical areas. Every topical area page has an Our Librarian Recommends box that highlights research and resources recommended by the SSRC library team. Each topical area page also includes relevant federal laws and regulations. Under the Stay Connected tab, you'll find entities involved in self-sufficiency research and a list of organizations here that have partnered with the SSRC to host events and share publications related to self-sufficiency. You'll also find an events calendar with in-person and virtual events relevant to the field of self-sufficiency. So please visit this tab to access previous webinar recordings and additional materials. Finally, the SSRC houses a number of data sets and resources to support program management and to facilitate improved outcomes for children, families, and communities. On the right side of your screen, you'll find links to the SSRC web pages, including our Emerging Scholars page and the library. Select any of the titles, then click the Browse To button, and they'll open in a new window. Now, turning to the SSRC's Emerging Scholars Initiative, we have several selection criteria. Emerging Scholars can be a graduate student or a degree recipient, but we wish them to have no more than 10 years experience, and someone who's currently doing research on self-sufficiency issues related to one of the 12 topics. We would like someone who is conducting high-quality research that fills a knowledge gap or addresses a self-sufficiency issue that warrants greater visibility. They can be working in an academic setting, a program, a think tank, or an agency setting. We're looking for varied kinds of speakers. Please feel free to nominate someone. On the lower left side of your screen is a box, and we're looking for nominations for future Emerging Scholars. Today's Emerging Scholar is Kristen Turney. She is an assistant professor of sociology at the University of California at Irvine. And she received her PhD at the University of Pennsylvania in sociology. And as you can see, her research and interests very much align with the SSRC, social inequality, child well-being, family demography, population health, and of course, incarceration and the intergenerational transmission of disadvantage. And as I mentioned, you can find her recent work on the SSRC. And we have invited Dr. Joyce Arditi to be a discussant today. She is a professor of human development and family studies at Virginia Tech and has a PhD in family studies from the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. And her research is also very much aligned with today's topic, being on parental incarceration and families, cumulative disadvantage, maternal distress, and family policy. So we welcome both of them, and I will now turn the mic over to Kristen. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot one thing I should mention before doing that. That is that you can submit questions at any time through the question and answer feature, which is at the bottom right part of the screen. The questions will be answered after the presentations, or if we run out of time, they will be posted on the SSRC. And now we will turn to Professor Turney. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris, for that kind introduction, and thank you very much for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here today to present some of my ongoing research on the collateral consequences of paternal incarceration for child well-being. Before I get started, I'd like to note that this work I'm going to present today has been supported by generous funding from the University of Kentucky Center for Poverty Research, the Spencer Foundation, and the National Academy of Education. This presentation will have 4 parts. First, I'll document the rising incarceration rates in the United States, which some of you may already be familiar with. Second, I'll discuss some existing research on how the transformation of the penal system affects children and families. Third, I'll talk specifically about my ongoing research in this area. And finally, I'll offer some policy and practice suggestions on how to ameliorate disadvantages experienced by children of incarcerated fathers. It's well known that the American incarceration rate has increased dramatically since the mid-1970s. This rise has mostly resulted from structural factors, such as inadequate job prospects for poorly educated men, and the punitive turn in criminal justice policy, such as felony convictions for drug crimes and increased sentencing length. This graph shows that up until about 1970, about 100 per 100,000 individuals in the population were incarcerated in state or federal prisons. But today, in 2014, that number stands at about 500 per 100,000. And when you consider men and women separately, that number goes up to about 900 men per 100,000 men in the population, represented by the red line. And when you consider only black men, which is not shown on the graph, the number is about 3,200 per 100,000 individuals. And these numbers, striking as they are, say nothing about men incarcerated in local jails, who comprise another substantial proportion of the incarcerated population. And they don't say anything about men who've been recently released from prison or jail back to their families and communities who are under the supervision of the criminal justice system. And the rapid growth of mass incarceration in the United States means that a historically unprecedented number of children experience parental, mostly paternal, which I'm going to focus on today, paternal incarceration. So more than 2.6 million children currently have a parent in federal prison, state prison, or jail, most of them for nonviolent offenses. And one of the most important things to know about paternal incarceration, and really incarceration in general, is that it is extremely unevenly distributed across the population. So this graph here shows the percentage of children born in 1990 who experienced paternal incarceration by age 14. Even among the most disadvantaged white children, children with fathers who dropped out of high school, paternal incarceration is far from commonplace. So about 7% of these children, white children of high school dropout fathers, experienced paternal incarceration by age 14, which is shown in that first green bar on the graph. This is in stark contrast to the more than half of black children whose fathers dropped out of high school, who can expect to experience paternal incarceration by age 14. Therefore, the incidence of paternal incarceration is extremely unequally distributed across lines of race and social class. And because of this, mass incarceration has important implications for the intergenerational transmission of inequality. In response to the large numbers of children who experience the incarceration of a father, as well as its potential implications for inequality, a rapidly expanding literature considers the wide-ranging intergenerational consequences of incarceration. There's too much of it to document here in the relatively short amount of time that I have, but there are some sort of excellent books and review articles on this topic that I'll list at the end of this presentation for readers who may be interested. There are good reasons to expect that paternal incarceration is deleterious for children. Incarceration is traumatizing, it removes fathers from households, and it increases household stress, all of which may cause children to suffer. But there are also good reasons to expect that, at least for some children, paternal incarceration may be a positive turning point. If a father is engaging in domestic violence, for example, against the child's mother, or heavily addicted to substances, the removal of a father from a household via incarceration may have some benefits for children. And furthermore, there's also good reason to believe that paternal incarceration may be inconsequential, at least from a causal perspective for children. Incarcerated fathers aren't randomly distributed across the population, and when studying the effects of paternal incarceration on children, it's quite possible that the same characteristics that are associated with incarceration are also associated with children's outcomes, such as poverty or impulsive behaviors. And therefore, it's possible that the relationship is spurious. And then finally, another possibility is that paternal incarceration may have different effects for different groups of children. So it may be that the effects of paternal incarceration aren't the same for all children. And I'm going to talk about, in the presentation today, I'm going to talk about two studies that I'm currently working on. The first one looks at the effects of paternal incarceration on children's food insecurity, and the second one looks at children's behavior problems and test scores. In both of these studies, I used data from the Fragile Families and Child Wellbeing Study. This is a birth cohort of children born to mostly unmarried parents in urban areas between 1998 and 1999. These data are ideal for many reasons. They're broadly representative of children. They are longitudinal, so mothers and fathers were interviewed at baseline when their children were born, and then again when their children were 1, 3, 5, and 9 years old. They also include information about paternal incarceration and child well-being. And they're also useful because many of these fathers experienced incarceration. And these incarcerated fathers are quite similar to fathers who are incarcerated in local jails, state prisons, and federal prisons nationally. And finally, they include extensive information about both parents and children, making it possible to control for many characteristics associated with selection into incarceration. And importantly, these data are the only broadly representative longitudinal data on a contemporary set of children in the U.S. that are available to answer these research questions, at least for young children. I mentioned earlier that the sample is comprised of mostly unmarried parents, not entirely unmarried parents, but mostly. And because of this, the sample is relatively disadvantaged across a range of demographic and socioeconomic characteristics. Mothers, for example, had their first birth on average at age 21. About half of mothers in the sample were non-Hispanic Black, and about a quarter of them were Hispanic, the same goes for fathers. And about 1/3 of mothers and fathers had less than a high school diploma. The first study I'm going to tell you about today asks one question. What are the effects of paternal incarceration on food insecurity among children? So why food insecurity? What's important about this measure? Food insecurity, defined as having limited access to adequate food due to lacking resources, is a sizable and persistent problem in the United States. In 2012, about 1/5 of children in the United States lived in food insecure households. And though adults often limit their own food consumption to ensure their children have enough to eat, about 1/10 of children live in households that report child food insecurity, an especially acute and severe form of deprivation. The relatively sizable number of children who experience food insecurity or live in households that experience food insecurity is especially troubling given the negative consequences of food insecurity for children's life chances. Food insecurity or hardship is associated with a host of academic outcomes, including reduced test scores, a greater likelihood of grade retention, and lower school engagement. This graph here shows the individual items comprising the measure of food insecurity, as measured by the USDA. To be considered food insecure, parents must answer affirmatively to 2 or more of these questions. As you can see, this these percentages, which are restricted to households with food insecure children, so households that do have 2 or more of these criteria. For these families, more than 90% of them report serving their children a few kinds of low-cost foods. About 90% report not being able to feed their children balanced meals. And about 45% report that their child is not eating enough. In this study, paternal incarceration is measured as any incarceration that occurred after the 3-year survey and up to and including the 5-year survey. So basically between the child's 3rd and 5th birthday. I rely on both mothers' and fathers' reports of fathers' incarceration, which is consistent with most other research using these data. And a couple of caveats about the measure of paternal incarceration, which are important caveats to keep in mind. First, I can't distinguish between whether the father was in prison or in jail. Second, I can't precisely estimate the length of his incarceration, so I don't know exactly how long he was incarcerated. And then third, the prevalence of incarceration, because it can be stigmatizing, may be underestimated. Even so, about 18% of fathers experience incarceration between the child's 3rd and 5th birthday, approximately. So this is quite common. This figure here just shows the timing of the variable measurement and the results I'm going to present. So for this study, I measure food insecurity at the 5-year survey when children are 5 years old. And really the reason for this is that this is the last time these questions were asked of families. Unfortunately, they weren't asked in the later 9-year survey wave. Paternal incarceration is measured between the 3 and the 5-year survey, as I mentioned. And then all of the control variables are measured prior to the 3-year survey. Descriptively, this graph shows the differences in food insecurity among children by paternal incarceration. So about 16% of children of incarcerated fathers experience food insecurity, compared to about 6% of children of not incarcerated fathers. So this is really the paternal incarceration. These children now have about 3 times the likelihood of experiencing food insecurity. And so for those interested in the sort of technical details of the analyses, I use propensity score matching methods in this study and in the next study I'm going to tell you about. This approach allows me to consider differences in child well-being between children who experience paternal incarceration to otherwise comparable children who do not experience paternal incarceration. So the important sort of takeaway point of the propensity score matching is that the 2 groups of children, those with paternal incarceration and those without, are the same on their observable characteristics, the characteristics that I can measure of their lives, except that one group experienced paternal incarceration and one group did not. So the ability to match these children on paternal incarceration, or on the other characteristics of their lives, is especially important given the really big differences between children who do and do not experience paternal incarceration. So I generate a propensity score for each observation as a function of a wide array of covariates, about 70 of them, including things that are especially associated with incarceration, such as substance use, domestic violence, or previous incarceration, to try to get at the causal effect of paternal incarceration on children's food insecurity. The propensity score is basically, it ranges from 0 to 1, and it's basically a probability that a child will experience paternal incarceration. And for those who are really interested in the technical details of these analyses, I restrict the analyses to regions of common support, ensure balance between the treatment and control groups, and use a variety of matching strategies, but I'm just going to talk about results from the kernel matching here. So the results suggest 2 things. First, I find that paternal incarceration is associated with increases in children's food insecurity. But importantly, there's striking variation in this association. So the relationship is really concentrated among children whose fathers lived with them prior to paternal incarceration. and there's no association among children whose fathers did not live with them prior to incarceration. The second project I'm going to talk about today asks the following question. What are the average and unequal effects of paternal incarceration on children's problem behaviors and test scores in middle childhood? I consider two measures of children's behavior problems: internalizing problem behaviors, such as the child cries a lot or the child feels worthless or inferior, and externalizing problem behaviors, such as the child destroys his or her own things, the child is impulsive or acts without thinking. These are measured with the Child Behavior Checklist, or the CBCL. And I also considered three measures of test scores: reading comprehension and math comprehension, which are both measured with subtests of the Woodcock-Johnson test, and verbal ability, which is measured with the Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test, or the PPVT. And all five of these measures are standardized to have a mean of 0 and a standard deviation of 1 so that I can compare across the measures pretty easily. And for these analyses, child well-being is measured at the 9-year survey. Paternal incarceration is measured at any point after the 1-year survey, up to and including the 9-year survey. Importantly, 31% of fathers experienced paternal incarceration between the child's first and 9th birthday, or between when the children were between 1 and 9 years old. All control variables are measured prior to paternal incarceration to account for the selectivity into incarceration. So they're measured at either the baseline or the 1-year survey. First here, I show the means, the standardized means, of children's behavior problems by paternal incarceration. Here for behavior problems, higher values are less favorable and lower values are more favorable. The green bars represent children with incarcerated fathers, and the blue bars represent children without incarcerated fathers. And as you can see, as expected, descriptively, children of incarcerated fathers have more behavioral problems than their counterparts. And for test scores here, keep in mind here that with test scores, lower values indicate less favorable outcomes, and higher values indicate more favorable outcomes. So here, children of incarcerated fathers have lower test scores than their counterparts, measured by reading comprehension, math comprehension, and verbal ability. And here I just present results from the propensity score matching estimates. The first column shows the unmatched differences between children with and without incarcerated fathers. So this is very much a similar approach as to just looking at the descriptives like I showed you in the previous two graphs. And as you see, the results are quite consistent as we would expect. So the magnitude of these differences, especially for some outcomes, is quite large. So for example, for children with incarcerated fathers have externalizing behaviors that are nearly 2/5 of a standard deviation higher than children without incarcerated fathers, just descriptively, not accounting for any selection into incarceration. And the second column presents results from the matching models that match on characteristics and take into account the fact that some fathers are not randomly assigned to incarceration. And so here we see paternal incarceration, even taking into account the selection story, is associated with higher internalizing and externalizing behaviors. But there are no differences in children's test scores, suggesting that the descriptive differences shown earlier result from selection forces. So the fact that fathers who are incarcerated are going to be the relationship between incarceration and children's test scores is really due to these other factors, such as maybe poverty or living maybe in a single-parent family or having a father who engages in substance abuse. These are the sorts of things that might matter. But I said earlier that the effects of paternal incarceration may not be the same for all children. And I looked at that a little bit earlier with food insecurity when I looked at differences by whether the father was living with the child prior to his incarceration or not. And I look at that again here, looking at how paternal incarceration affects children across the distribution of propensity scores. That is, across the distribution of the risk for paternal incarceration. And this graph here presents results from those analyses. So for reference, children in the first bar, those who have a 0 to 20% chance of having an incarcerated father, those are the children who are least likely to have an incarcerated father. These kids are relatively advantaged across an array of demographic and socioeconomic characteristics. They're more likely to be living with married parents before the father is imprisoned. They're more likely to not be living in poverty, these sorts of things. They're more advantaged than the other two groups I'm going to talk about. But they're not too advantaged, keep in mind, because the Fragile Families data is a pretty disadvantaged group on average. So these kids aren't sort of upper middle class children. Children in the second bar have a 20 to 40% chance of experiencing paternal incarceration. And then children in the third bar have a high likelihood, a 40 to 80% chance of experiencing incarceration. So I should say that no children had an 80 to 100% chance of experiencing incarceration. So these kids in this last bar are they're a really relatively disadvantaged group. And so as you can see, the effects of incarceration are strongest, they're largest, the bar is highest for children with a relatively low risk of experiencing paternal incarceration, those with a 0 to 20% chance, compared to those, and also especially compared to those with a 40 to 80% chance of experiencing incarceration. And if you look at the asterisk above the column, you'll see that in the 0 to 20% group and in the 20 to 40% group, children with and without incarcerated fathers are statistically different from one another. But in the 40 to 80% group, there's no asterisk, which means there's no differences between children with and without incarcerated fathers. And importantly, these differences between groups are statistically significant. There's a similar pattern with respect to internalizing problem behaviors, but here, of course, there are statistically significant differences between children with and without incarcerated fathers in all groups. And then really interestingly, the findings here hold up for measures of test scores, with children who have the lowest risk of experiencing paternal incarceration having the worst effect. This is especially interesting because recall that the average effects I presented earlier showed that there are no effects, average effects, of paternal incarceration on test scores. But here, trying to sort of investigate some of the nuances, you'll see that for children with a 0 to 20% likelihood of experiencing paternal incarceration, there are statistically significant differences, and they're pretty large in magnitude, about 1/4 of a standard deviation, between children with and without incarcerated fathers, suggesting that considering only the average effect masks these differences and ignores how different groups of children may be differentially vulnerable to incarceration. The similar findings hold up for math comprehension and for children's verbal ability. Okay, so to summarize all of the findings that I presented here, I know it was a lot. I find broadly representative evidence estimating average effects of paternal incarceration in middle childhood. I find negative effects on average for children's food insecurity, negative effects on children's behavior problems, and no average effects on children's test scores. But in the case, so considering the average effects, though, really masks considerable heterogeneity. So the effects of paternal incarceration aren't the same for everyone. In the case of food insecurity, it really matters if the father is living with the child before he's incarcerated. The effects are really concentrated among these children. But in the case of behavior problems and test scores, I didn't present these results. But it actually, I did these analyses, and it doesn't matter if the father is living with the child before he's incarcerated, the effects on behavior problems and test scores are the same regardless of the father's residential status, which suggests first that incarceration can have wide-ranging effects, and two, taken in combination with the results about food insecurity, to show just how complicated it is to develop a comprehensive understanding of paternal incarceration. And interestingly, for behavior problems and test scores, though father's residential status doesn't seem to matter too much, the effects still aren't the same for all children. Here, it really depends on the children's risk of experiencing paternal incarceration. So what's going on here? It's possible that children unlikely to experience paternal incarceration have a relatively advantaged social context. And for these children, paternal incarceration may be an unexpected event that's really detrimental for family life. The effects of incarceration may be more dramatic and pronounced for these children, as it's likely that these families experience the biggest loss, suffer the greatest changes in family routines, are unprepared for the resultant hardship that comes with incarceration, and are unable to mobilize social support networks. Another explanation is that given the relatively advantaged social context of these children's lives, they have further to fall. But I did some supplemental analyses, which I didn't present here, and it suggests that that's not the case. Also importantly, it's important to keep in mind that the group of children where we didn't see any independent effects of paternal incarceration, those children who have a very high risk of experiencing incarceration. It's not to say that incarceration may not matter, but for these children, they experience so many other disadvantages, such as poverty, single parenthood, potentially mental health problems of parents, a host of disadvantages, that paternal incarceration may not matter given the other sort of disadvantages that these children face. All right, and though the findings suggest that incarceration has complicated and complex effects on children, they don't explain why paternal incarceration has negative effects on children, or at least some children. Future research should further investigate why paternal incarceration matters for children. Theoretically, there's lots of reasons to expect why there might be negative effects on children. For one, the effects may be direct. Incarceration removes fathers from households. Many of these fathers were economically and emotionally contributing to family life prior to incarceration. But also the effects may be indirect. There are at least 4 indirect pathways through which incarceration may lead to deleterious outcomes for children. So first, it's well known from previous literature. There's a lot of literature that shows incarceration reduces, it increases economic hardship and reduces family income. It places strain on the parental relationship, facilitating relationship dissolution and conflict. It impairs mothers' and fathers' parenting. And it increases both mothers' and fathers' health problems, especially their mental health problems such as depression. And all of these factors have been linked to children's well-being. Note that these are only some of the pathways. There are certainly others, such as trauma or visitation. And in fact, food insecurity may be a pathway linking paternal incarceration to children's behavior problems and test scores. And fully understanding these mechanisms and the complexities in which these mechanisms may be operating is a really important direction for future research. And finally, there are several policy implications that emerge from the work I just presented. So first, at sort of a basic level, paternal incarceration has spillover effects for children. To some extent, this is getting attention from the public. So last year, the long-running children's TV show Sesame Street introduced a new series to help aid children with incarcerated parents. But even more can be done. The effects of paternal incarceration on children means that schools and potentially after-school programs may consider having programs in place for these children. Additionally, sentencing decisions, at least for nonviolent offenses, should take into account these unintended spillover effects. And second, the effects of paternal incarceration are unequal. This means that programs might want to target not only children most at risk of paternal incarceration, but also children most at risk of negative effects of paternal incarceration. It's important to not ignore these children, to keep in mind that really the effects of incarceration are quite complicated and there may not be a one-size-fits-all solution. Taken together, results show that mass incarceration is changing the landscape of American childhood. Here I presented some additional resources for your information, and thank you. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Kristen. Please do submit questions using the Q&A box at the bottom right of your screen. And now we look forward very much to having our discussant, Dr. Joyce Arditi. Joyce?
Thank you, Chris. I do want to say that for whatever reason I'm not able to see anything, but luckily we've got the phone. I'm not really sure what happened here on my internet connection, but I don't think I need to see anything. I'm on and I'm good.
Thank you.
First of all, I'd like to thank Kristen for her work. I wanted to just make a couple of points and then I'll ask her a couple of questions and hopefully can be part of the conversation about this very important issue. One of the things that I think in terms of the contribution of Kristen's work that really struck me is this work on food insecurity, because nobody has really looked at that as a feature of adversity and how it might connect with parental incarceration. And Kristen mentioned the disproportionate impact of mass incarceration on disadvantaged families of color. And in this particular study on food insecurity, it really highlights a critical feature of cumulative disadvantage and how paternal incarceration may be a hidden contributor to this phenomenon. In other words, other scholars are doing work in this area, but really aren't paying much attention to the issue of incarceration. And it could be, from what Kristen is saying, that when there are residents in the home prior to incarceration, that it can contribute to food insecurity among the families of these men. And so we find from Kristen's work that paternal incarceration is actually potentially a mechanism of effect for a very important feature of cumulative disadvantage. And food insecurity, the stats I have, it says it's about 15% of American households, or about 17.9 million households. And I think that it's very important because food insecurity is a real pathway for poor developmental consequences in children, and also health problems that extend into adulthood. So in this manner, I think future research can really zero in on food insecurity as a mechanism of effect, particularly in terms of the intergenerational transmission of poverty and disadvantage, and perhaps even incarceration. The other thing I thought of when Kristen was talking about food insecurity is it is another source of stress for already overburdened caregivers. And there is research that, points to resiliency among families dealing with food insecurity. But if you think about all the kinds of things justice-involved families must deal with, to also have to, come up with strategies to, make sure that your children are fed, that to me is a really unique source of stress. So I just wanted to kind of applaud Kristen for doing this work. I've not seen anything on food insecurity in the literature on incarceration. I think it's potentially very important. The other thing that stands out to me about Kristen's work is how important contextual factors or moderators in terms of moderating influences, in terms of how incarceration impacts children. Kristen is exactly right to say that it's a very, very complicated picture. And it really depends on many factors. Her work points to the importance of father's residence prior to incarceration. Obviously, if the parent is not in residence and certainly not contributing to the household, the incarceration may have less of an effect. So I think that future research can really extend this by studying more carefully, what pre-incarceration factors seem to really matter. Kristen mentions that there's various outcomes that are possible for children, that it's possibly that they're not affected or they could be beneficially affected by incarceration. And I think having a better sense of what these critical moderators are is a real contribution. So from this study, we can clearly say, father's residence, pre-incarceration, big moderator, very important. So I think that's important to pay attention to. And then my final point that I'd like to comment on is, as Kristen mentioned, it is a complex situation. And so, I think it's very obvious that there is no one-size-fits-all response in terms of how best to help children. I think, the first order of business is, a social justice, framework which, addresses the issue of social inequality and cumulative disadvantage, because that is something that's threaded throughout the research, including Kristen. We must be careful not to blindly promote programmatic interventions aimed at father involvement or, visitation or things like that without attending to some of, really the elephant in the room, which is mass incarceration policies. We also must acknowledge the realities of family life on the outside, which may or may not include the incarcerated father, or perhaps, children have social fathers or other kin that are serving as role models. So I think that it is a very complex situation. Most families that are justice involved have very complex family structures, and many incarcerated men have children in more than one household. So interventions and policies really need to acknowledge this complexity and focus first on promoting and strengthening proximal relationships in children's lives, empowering primary caregivers to provide for their children, and then secondly, looking at how best to facilitate family relationships with incarcerated parents and whether that's in a child's best interest. So those are my major comments with regard to the research that Kristen has presented. I think she's taken some first steps to looking at some of these moderators and mediating mechanisms. Kristen, one of the questions I have for you is, under what conditions do you think that incarceration may do less harm to children or perhaps even be beneficial to them? You mentioned the issue of domestic violence, but in your work, have you found other instances where, you didn't quite find the negative effects, or perhaps another question is, have you uncovered any resilience factors amongst the families or the data that you've looked at? Things that mitigate the harm of incarceration.
That's a great, should I answer your question now, or did you have others, or?
Yeah, no, that's it.
Okay, great. Great, these comments are really, really great, and you really highlighted some of the thorny issues, I think, when studying this, and also when thinking about policy as well. So you had asked, under what conditions may incarceration be maybe potentially positive? So I will say I haven't found, in my work, I haven't found any cases when it is positive. So I have found instances where it is, where there are negative effects of, null effects of paternal incarceration. So, for example, with some outcomes like food insecurity, when the fathers aren't living in the household, it doesn't seem to have a sort of causal effect on children. I haven't found it to be positive at all. I also should draw your attention to, there's some other work, some work by Christopher Wildeman and Amanda Geller separately. They have some separate papers that also look at this issue of paternal incarceration and child well-being. And both of them find that when the father is engaged in domestic violence against the mother before he goes to prison or jail, they both find independently that there's no effect of paternal incarceration. So I do think that there's some evidence that for those children in those families where domestic violence is occurring, paternal incarceration may not be associated with such deleterious outcomes for children. Certainly, though, I think really is what you're doing is you're hitting on some factors and some ideas of where the research really needs to go. And these are the things that we really need to be thinking about when we're designing new studies and thinking about new ways to study this topic. I think that some of the results I presented today and some other work that's out there shows that really this is a really complicated issue, and really disentangling some of these factors and these resilience factors you mentioned is really, really important. And I don't think we're there yet, I would say. And I hope that we will be there soon.
Okay, thank you so much. We have a related question has come in from the audience. This is Chris Moore. I'm wondering, are there data on how many fathers were in the home before incarceration, this group where the father was living in the home?
Yes, there are data on that. So I don't know the numbers off the top of my head, but I do have a recently published paper with one of my collaborators, Chris Wildeman, and we do look at this issue. We look at the effects of paternal incarceration on fathers' parenting, and we find actually a very similar story where, just really briefly, that paternal incarceration does have these negative effects on fathers' parenting, of course, while he's incarcerated, but then after release as well, so these lasting effects. And in that study, we again find that it is concentrated among fathers who are living with their children beforehand. And in that study, it was about half of the sample were about, give or take a few percentage points, about half of the sample were living with their children before their fathers were incarcerated, or before they were incarcerated. So it is, I think a conception with sometimes for some people is that these fathers who are getting locked up are not that involved in their kids' lives. And while that is certainly true for some fathers, for many fathers, they really are engaged with their children. They are contributing economically to family life, even if it's not the sort of 9-to-5 stable job. They're still piecing together sources of employment, informal sources of employment, formal sources of employment. They're contributing economically to their families. They're involved with their kids, and they want to be involved with their kids. And some of them are, or half of them or so, are living with their kids. So I do think that it is important to keep in mind that though it's a very diverse group, I guess. That's really the point. Some of them are quite involved, and some of them are not.
Kristen, this is Joyce, and I think one of the issues is the lack of good pre-incarceration data and the lack of information about fathers' involvement and engagement with their children. Because, for example, even the Fragile Families data set, a lot of the data sets aren't really designed to answer questions about incarceration and don't have good family process data in there. So, I think it's a real challenge for researchers. There are some studies suggesting that they were in residence, and there's other studies suggesting they paid support or were providing, or that they were working at the time of incarceration. But I think that, on the one hand, intuitively we know it's a very diverse group. On the other hand, I don't think we have a really good idea as to what those relationships are like.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I think, and just to sort of take it even one step farther, I think that in recent years there's been growing attention to this issue of incarceration and how it affects families and children, and that is wonderful. And there's been a lot of attention to answering causal questions about, is there an quote-unquote effect of paternal incarceration? But really we're working with limited data. And I think to really push this literature forward, being able to collect better data, as you say, on both family process before incarceration, but also family process during incarceration and after incarceration, and also collecting better measures of incarceration in itself, I think would be a really valuable way to push this literature forward.
Thank you.
That's a really important conversation, and it shows the value of descriptive data, not just the complex analyses, but both are important. A question has come in about gender. Do you have information on differences by child gender?
Oh, that is a great question. So I didn't do any of that work because it's been done before. So I think, again, both of the authors I mentioned earlier, Christopher Wildeman and Amanda Geller, they both have papers. Chris is published in Social Forces, and Amanda is published in Demography. And actually it's Amanda and a whole research team. And they find in their work that the effects of paternal incarceration are stronger for boys than for girls. And, you know, so that's sort of out there, and I don't think we quite know why. There's been some speculation that, you know, maybe sort of losing a same-gendered parent might be especially consequential for boys, and but it is certainly something we know a little bit about, but we don't know a ton about.
Mm-hmm. So another question, thank you very much. So a quick person is asking, you mentioned that it matters if fathers are in jail versus prison, and we don't know which they're in. Why would it matter if fathers are in jail versus being in prison?
That's a great question. So it might matter, it might not matter. I suspect that, so how it might matter for children is that prisons are often located quite far from where children live. So fathers are oftentimes incarcerated maybe in the county they live in, but more oftentimes not the county they live in. And so it's very expensive. So that's an issue of visitation. So when fathers are in prison, it is usually quite costly for these low-income families who are struggling to make ends meet, for them to sort of get transportation, to be able to take time off of work, et cetera, to go visit the father if he's in prison and he's located far away. And with jails are usually located closer to home. The other big difference between prison and jail and how it might affect children is that prisons are usually, people go to prison for a longer period of time, usually a year or longer, whereas for jail, people are more, they're more likely to be in for a short amount of time, so less than a year. But the interesting thing is, and again, I don't think we know the answer to this, but I suspect that people who go to jail are more likely to sort of cycle through jail. So they may go to jail for 6 months, they may be released, they may go back, they may be released. And I suspect actually that type of instability, we know from the family demography literature that instability is what's really bad for kids, right? It's not divorce necessarily, it's instability that oftentimes follows divorce. And so when you think about incarceration, like, I mean, there's a lot of commonalities between incarceration and divorce. Of course, they're not the same. But I think you could imagine a situation where if a father is really cycling through the system, which is more likely if he's in jail, he may be more likely to cycle through. That may be really bad for kids. Whereas with prison, if a father is going to be incarcerated for, say, 5 years in prison, it may actually give mothers a chance. So of course some mothers and parents stay together during the prison sentence or, and or a jail sentence. But a prison, with it being such a long-term sentence, it does give mothers a chance to, if they want to break off a bad relationship. It's an easier break because he's going to be away for a long period of time. And that may mean that children are exposed to less instability. But this is all speculation. I don't think we know the answers to these questions, but these are some of the ways that I think about these issues.
This is Joyce, can I elaborate on that? I think what Kristen said is very interesting, and especially, pertaining to how far families might live from the facility. They definitely might live farther if somebody's in prison, and then it depends whether it's state or federal. But the other thing about jails, actually, people are, because of prison overcrowding, you are seeing people staying in jail for longer and longer periods of time. And often they house state and federal prisoners as well. So people are in jail for lots of reasons, but I think one of the most fundamental differences has to do with institutional practices and visitation. And so in jails, I've done research in jails, and jails by and large have no contact visiting procedures, which is like what you see on TV, behind the glass, on the telephone. Whereas prisons often allow contact visits where you go into a visiting room, you sit down at a table with each other. Some prisons even have facilities where you can go outside. So you've got a much shorter and highly restrictive visitation scenario with jails. And so depending on the age of the child, you are potentially setting the stage for, some real confusion and trauma, particularly young children, and looking in that glass and not being able to touch their parents.
Mm-hmm. Oh, interesting. Thank you. I guess we have time for one more question, which is, the negative effects are most clear for the child's behavior. Is that how the intergenerational effects occur, or is there something else?
That's a good question. So there's some work done by Joe Murray and David Farrington. They've done some work where they really have studied so in terms of intergenerational effects, do you mean sort of the intergeneration, if you mean the intergenerational transmission of, say, paternal incarceration to child delinquency and child incarceration, that could, so Joe Murray and David Farrington have sort of shown that there, along with some other people, that there is this relationship, and certainly behavior is potentially one of those strong links, absolutely.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I want to thank Kristen Turney and also Joyce Arditi for a very provocative, interesting, and informative webinar. And those of you who have any additional questions, please feel free to submit them in the Q&A, and also please complete the exit survey. We thank you very much for joining us.
And this does conclude today's conference call. Thank you for your participation. You may now disconnect.